The wind leans gently against the hills of northern Hungary, curling through trees older than memory and brushing across the crumbled stone remains of a castle that no longer knows its name. Wild ivy slips between the cracks of long-dead mortar. Once proud towers now slump, exhausted, into the earth like tired bones returning to rest. Fog pools low in the valleys as if waiting for a signal to rise. And on some nights, when the owls are hushed and the dogs won't bark, the villagers swear they hear something: soft footsteps, a faint sob, the rustle of satin dragging across a cold flagstone floor. Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we will step gently into the dim corridors of history, not the dry dates and names variety, but the kind that breathes, thick with perfume and blood, echoing with whispered prayers, manic laughter, and secrets pressed under velvet skirts. Tonight, you and I walk beside one of the most chilling figures in European legend and documented cruelty. Her name is Countess Elizabeth Báthory. And her story, half legend, half terrifying fact, is one of opulence, violence, obsession, and ultimately, isolation so absolute it turns stone into a tomb. Before we descend into the candlelit halls of Čachtice Castle and the blood-stained decades that preceded its silence, take a moment to gently tap the like button. If these tales speak to some hidden part of your curiosity, consider subscribing. Here, we treat history not as a school subject, but as the strange, messy, human epic that it truly is. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. She was born into winter. The frost had barely begun to thaw in Nyírbátor when Elizabeth Báthory entered the world in August of 1560. Though the season was summer, the chill of power, inheritance, and blood was already in her bones. She was born into one of the most powerful Protestant noble families in the Kingdom of Hungary, surrounded by landowners, warriors, and king's confidants. The Bathory name wasn't whispered, it was proclaimed. With it came gold, soldiers, alliances, enemies. And stories. The world she entered was brutal, but beautiful. The nobles' halls were candlelit and echoing, filled with languages she learned to mimic before she could walk: Hungarian, Latin, German, Slovak. The peasants toiled in the fields below those castles, backs broken, fingers cracked, raising wheat and children in the same breath. Elizabeth never truly saw them. Not then. She was a sickly child. Prone to seizures, bouts of confusion, migraines that made the corners of her vision blur and flicker like the wings of moths. Today, some believe she may have suffered from epilepsy, but in the 16th century, such fits were misunderstood. They were either signs of possession, or, more intriguingly for the aristocracy, signs of divine favor. Young Elizabeth would convulse and scream, and the priests would gather to bless her. The servants crossed themselves. Her parents observed her with a strange mix of dread and pride. She was not coddled. That wasn't the Bathory way. Her education was rigorous, particularly for a girl. By 12, she could quote Tacitus and compose letters in Latin. She was taught how to manage estates, how to break a wild horse, how to poison a rival discreetly. All the useful arts of Hungarian nobility. But there were other lessons too. Harsher ones. At dinner, it wasn't uncommon to see servants whipped for spilling wine. One family legend claimed that Elizabeth, at age 10, watched a thief sewn into the belly of a dead horse and left to rot. Did she flinch? Did she ask questions? No record remains. But what does remain, again and again, is a portrait of a girl growing up in a world where pain was not hidden, it was administered. By the time she was 14, Elizabeth was betrothed to Ferenc Nadasdy, a man 5 years older and of equal pedigree. The marriage was political, naturally. The two houses would merge power, land, armies. No one asked Elizabeth how she felt about this arrangement. Feelings were for peasants. She was trained, not raised. Groomed to endure. Groomed to command. The wedding, in 1575, was lavish even by noble standards. Over 4,000 guests. Gold-threaded gowns. A feast that lasted 3 days. There were rumors of a virgin sacrifice, a superstition, most likely, but in Elizabeth's circle, superstition was often only a half-step from reality. When Ferenc presented her with Čachtice Castle as a wedding gift, it was more than a symbol of love. It was a stage. A fortress. A future mausoleum. Ferenc was a warrior. Tall, grim, rarely home. He earned the nickname, the Black Knight of Hungary, for his particularly cruel tactics against the Ottoman Turks. He would impale prisoners, skin them alive, and send body parts back as warnings. Elizabeth adored him. Or perhaps she admired his efficiency. When he was gone, which was often, Elizabeth ruled the estates. She was precise, intelligent, unforgiving. The servants feared her. The peasants cursed her name beneath their breath. But to the nobles? She was perfect. Elegant. Sharp. Beautiful, even. Her dark hair, pale skin, and ice-born grace made her the envy of the Viennese court. But something began to shift after the birth of her first daughter, Anna. Then a son. Then another daughter. Motherhood softened many noblewomen. It did not soften Elizabeth. In fact, it seemed to agitate her. She became more reclusive, less patient. Complaints from her staff increased. A maid claimed she was slapped so hard her earring tore through her ear. Another disappeared entirely. Whispers began. But they were only whispers. After all, she was a countess. Then came the letters. They started appearing in the hands of bishops, inspectors, distant cousins. Reports of unusual punishments. Girls taken from villages to serve in the castle, never seen again. Children going missing. Elizabeth's cruelty, they said, had turned theatrical. She liked to strike girls with needles, bite their shoulders, burn them with hot irons. One servant claimed to have seen a girl stripped naked, doused in honey, and tied in the courtyard for ants. Still, nothing was done. Why? Because power is a curtain, and Elizabeth's was thick and velvet. Ferenc, for all his savagery on the battlefield, was a bulwark at home. He dismissed the rumors, paid the right priests, offered pardons. And Elizabeth? She wore pearls, sent gifts, smiled graciously at banquets. No one wanted to believe that a noblewoman of such breeding could be monstrous. But power is never permanent. In 1604, Ferenc's Nadesty fell ill and died. Just like that. The Black Knight was gone. Elizabeth was 44, a widow, and fully in control of vast estates and hundreds of servants. And then the blood began to flow in earnest. Without Ferenc's restraint, or distraction, Elizabeth's behavior turned from cruel to compulsive. She began surrounding herself with a coterie of sycophants, mystics, and enablers. Chief among them, Anna d'Arvilla, an aging nurse with a reputation for sorcery, Ilona Jo, a harsh former governess, and Dorothea Sentis, also known as Dorka, who had her own taste for violence. Together, they created a kind of private theater of cruelty. A hidden court. And the castle became a stage. Elizabeth now turned her attention fully to young peasant girls. Some were brought under the guise of service, others simply abducted. It's said that she favored the beautiful ones. That she would test their skin, their nails, their hair. She would instruct them to undress slowly. Any resistance was met with sudden, exquisite violence. And then came the blood rituals. Some say she bathed in it. Others say she only smeared it across her face. A few letters suggest she believed it would preserve her youth. Most likely it was all of the above. What is certain is this: bodies were piling up. Hidden in the castle gardens. Thrown into shallow graves. Stuffed into corners. One peasant girl's body was discovered with every finger broken, her ribs shattered, mouth sewn shut. Still, the law did not move. Why? Because Elizabeth was a Bathory. But every curtain has its fray. In 1610, a Lutheran minister finally broke the silence. He preached openly about the disappearances. More parents came forward. Noble families, whose daughters had been sent to the Countess for refinement, began demanding answers. And then the king stepped in. Not for justice, mind you, but because debts were owed. Elizabeth, despite her wealth, had extended her reach too far. The crown wanted an excuse to strip her holdings. Now they had one. Enter Georgy Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary. A man with ambition, patience, and an old friendship with Ferenc Nadasdy. He was tasked with investigating Elizabeth. And on a freezing December night, with a group of guards and scribes, Thurzo arrived at Čachtice Castle. What he found would haunt Europe for centuries. Let's pause here, just for a breath. The wind through these ancient hills still tastes of something metallic, doesn't it? In the next section, we'll step inside that castle. We'll walk its frozen corridors. We'll see what Thurzo saw. And we'll ask, how much of the legend was real, and how much was just too monstrous for men to admit was true. Until then, sleep with one eye open. They came at night. History often dramatizes moments like this: torches blazing, hoofs pounding, banners snapping in the cold wind. But the truth, as always, is more uncomfortable, more mundane. It was a damp December evening in 1610. Snow was falling in small, anxious flurries, barely settling on the muddy trails that led up to Čachtice Castle. The guards and scribes under Count Georgi Thurzo wore thick coats against the chill, their boots heavy with frost and reluctance. They did not expect what they would find. Čachtice Castle loomed like a sullen beast over the hills, angular, distant, quiet. No warm glow from within. No laughter. The drawbridge creaked open under Thurzo's seal. The sentries did not resist. Elizabeth's household, it seemed, was no longer as careful, no longer as watchful. Or perhaps they had simply grown tired of trying to hide the stench. Thurzo, wrapped in velvet and fur, stepped inside first. The air was wrong. The castle didn't smell of smoke, or wine, or the perfumes of a noble court. It smelled of iron. Of old sweat and animal musk, and something underneath all that, like meat gone too long in a cellar. The first scream came from a side corridor. Thurzo's men followed it like dogs on a leash. Down the stone steps. Past the torchlit walls. Into the belly of the castle. What they found there would later be described in one scribe's journal as unfit for Christian eyes. A girl, barely more than 15, was splayed out on a table. Her wrists were slit, but not deeply. The cuts were shallow, measured, precise. As if someone had been studying her pain. A second girl, naked and unconscious, lay nearby, her back a web of old bruises and burns. In a corner, chained to the wall, another servant whimpered in fear, her mouth sewn shut crudely with horsehair thread. And in the center of it all, Countess Elizabeth Báthory, wearing a dark red gown. Not alarmed. Not apologetic. Not mad. Merely annoyed. She did not scream. She did not beg. She reportedly looked at Thurzo with something like boredom and asked why he hadn't written ahead. There are many versions of this moment, some far bloodier, others more theatrical. One later pamphlet claimed she was caught mid-ritual, knife in hand, her face painted with the blood of a virgin. That version, however, came decades after her death, as the legend of the Blood Countess grew more deliciously lurid. The truth was quieter, but no less disturbing. Thurzo ordered the castle searched. What they discovered, room by room, stunned even the most battle-hardened guards. Torture devices, many custom-built. A cage shaped like a human torso. Branding irons. Spiked collars. Vats of something thick and red. In the lower chambers, bodies, some fresh, some skeletal. And in the kitchen, a list. A ledger, really. Meticulously handwritten. Names. Ages. Dates. The Countess, it seemed, kept records. Over 600 names. 600. It was not just peasant girls. Some, reportedly, were of noble blood. Promised better lives. Promised elegance and polish and music lessons. Instead, they were whipped, pierced, broken. Elizabeth believed she was perfecting them. She was not a sadist, she once wrote, but a sculptor of discipline. The next morning, Thurzo ordered her arrest. Here's where it gets political. You might expect a grand trial. A parade of witnesses. A fiery courtroom finale. But this was Hungary in the 17th century, and Elizabeth was no commoner. She was a noblewoman of extraordinary rank. A public trial would drag the entire aristocracy through the mud, and mud sticks. So Thurzo struck a compromise. Elizabeth's accomplices, Anna d'Arvilla, though she may have died just before the arrest, Ilona Jo, Dorothea Sentis, and others, would be tried publicly. Executed. Quickly. Harshly. The people needed closure, and blood always played well in the square. But Elizabeth herself? No. She would not face trial. She would not be paraded in rags before the mob. Instead, she was quietly sentenced by royal decree. Imprisonment. Life. In her own castle. Countess Castle would become her tomb. They walled her into a room. This part is not metaphorical. The stonemasons came. They bricked shut the windows, the door. Left only a narrow slit, no wider than a loaf of bread, through which food could be passed once a day. Her screams, if there were any, went unheard. Inside, Elizabeth wrote letters. Pleas. Declarations of innocence. She accused her enemies of conspiracy. She begged the king for mercy. She wrote of her children, of her loneliness, of her righteousness and discipline. She claimed she had only ever sought moral improvement in her wards. She said nothing of the blood. Her children never visited. Over the course of 4 years, she wasted away. Her skin, once porcelain, turned gray. Her hair thinned. Her eyes, always sharp, cold, began to dim. The woman who had once commanded entire provinces, who had once terrified armies of servants with a glance, was now just a whisper in a stone box. She died on August 21, 1614. Alone. No priest. No comfort. No flowers. And then, history began its work. Legends are parasites. They feed on fear, on silence, on the spaces where truth has been buried too shallow. In the centuries that followed her death, Elizabeth Báthory became something else. No longer a countess, no longer a woman. She became myth. The Blood Countess. They said she bathed in virgin blood to preserve her youth. That she wore flayed skin like a cape. That she danced naked in the snow, surrounded by corpses. That she was a vampire. The female Vlad the Impaler. Were any of these things true? Well, some. She almost certainly didn't bathe in blood. There's no reliable evidence for that, and the logistics alone boggle the mind. But she did kill. By her hand, or her order, or her neglect. She caused pain. She fed on power. She relished control. But here's the twist: some scholars argue she was framed. They point out that many accusations came from those who owed her money. That the trial was politically convenient. That torture was normalized in her time, and that male nobles committed far worse without consequence. That her ledger may have been forged. That her gender made her an easier target. Was she a monster? Or was she a noblewoman with enemies? The truth is probably both. But monsters are not born in shadows. They are built in daylight. In drawing rooms? In marble halls. They are educated, praised, feared. They wear silk. They speak Latin. They write letters about morality. Elizabeth Báthory was not an accident. She was a mirror held up to a sick society. One that believed some bloodlines were worth more than others. That cruelty could be refined. That power was beauty. And when she finally crossed the line, when she turned from noble cruelty to unsanctioned madness, only then was she cast out. But the legend? Oh, the legend lives on. Now, take a breath. Lean back. In the next section, we'll return to those early days. Not Elizabeth's, but Hungary's. We'll explore the brutal world of 16th century Central Europe. The wars. The witches. The empires that raised her, and the fires that shaped her mind. Because to understand the Blood Countess, we must understand the world that made her thirst. There's a kind of cold that only comes from deep history. The kind that doesn't just settle on the skin but whispers against the bones. To understand the path Elizabeth Báthory walked, we must look beyond her. Behind her. At the land she ruled. The soil she bled on. The fractured, fire-scorched kingdom of Hungary in the late 1500s. It was not a gentle place. Hungary, at the time of Elizabeth's birth, was a cracked mirror reflecting 3 different empires. One part ruled by the Habsburgs, those tight-lipped Austrians with their clocks and crossbows. Another part claimed by the Ottoman Empire, where sultans in Istanbul issued decrees that bent the Danube like a ribbon. And in between? Royal Hungary. A ghost kingdom. A contested ground. A war-torn land that shifted with each battle and betrayed its peasants every few seasons. Borders bled here as often as people did. And into this chaos, the nobility. Hungarian aristocracy was a strange breed, half warrior, half courtier. Their castles were not just homes but fortresses. Their titles were earned as often through bloodshed as through inheritance. They held duels over stolen livestock. They brokered marriages like treaties. They toasted God and slit throats before breakfast. Elizabeth's ancestors were the mold. The Bathory family traced its lineage back to the 13th century. They claimed descent from Stephen Bathory, who had risen through the ranks to become Palatine of Hungary and later Prince of Transylvania. Yes, that Transylvania, the region already steeped in wolf howls and candlelit dread. Their coat of arms was a dragon biting its own tail. Their estates sprawled across the Carpathians like the veins of a sleeping beast. But power does not keep itself. It must be fought for. And so, generation after generation, the Bathorys fought. Against invaders. Against rivals. Against rumors. Against each other. Elizabeth's own childhood was shaped by this violence. Her uncle was a prince of Transylvania. Her cousin was accused of alchemy. Another relative was executed for treason. Her world was not one of dolls and lullabies, but of executions, military councils, and whispered poisonings at banquets. Add to this a fervent religious divide. Hungary was a crucible of faith. Catholicism had long been dominant, but the Reformation had crept in like smoke under a door. Lutheranism, Calvinism, Unitarianism. Zealots from each branch preached, burned books, and occasionally each other. Elizabeth's family leaned Protestant, though she employed Catholic priests and corresponded with Jesuits when convenient. This duality, this split in every layer of life, political, spiritual, cultural, created a particular kind of tension. A world where truth was negotiable. Where loyalty was temporary. Where everyone wore a different face depending on the hour. It is no surprise that someone like Elizabeth, raised within these contradictions, learned to lie so beautifully. But even more formative than politics or faith was war. The Ottomans were not a distant threat. They were at the gates. Raiding parties crossed the border regularly. Towns burned. Men disappeared. Women were taken. And Ferenc Nadasdy, Elizabeth's husband-to-be, became one of the most brutal defenders of the realm. Ferenc fought not just with sword and musket, but with fear. He hung corpses from trees to intimidate the enemy. He salted the wounds of prisoners to draw out screams. And when he returned home, he did not wash the blood from his hands. He taught his wife. He showed her tricks. Discipline, he called it. Efficiency. One story, told by multiple sources, claims that Ferenc once gifted Elizabeth a glove fitted with claws. Not for defense. For punishment. She used it often. So let us be clear. Before she ever tortured a servant. Before the castle grew quiet with unspoken dread. Before her name became a warning told by candlelight. Elizabeth Bathory had already been trained. Now take this image with you, a young noblewoman, standing on a castle balcony, watching smoke rise from a burning village. She is 16. Her hands are clean. For now. But her eyes? Her eyes are already learning. In the next section, we'll return to those early experiments. The first signs of obsession. The girls who vanished long before Thurzo came knocking. And the rituals, half science, half sorcery, that Elizabeth began to build in the privacy of her darkening mind. Shall we step a little closer? Let us step quietly now into the shadowed corners of Countess Castle before the arrest. The scent of lavender lingers in some rooms, mixed with something sharper, metallic, bitter. At a glance, it is a noble estate, chandeliers dripping with crystal, tapestries heavy with ancestral glory, servants bustling past with downcast eyes. But beneath the silk and polish, the castle breathes like something alive, something watchful. It is here, in the years between Ferencz's long absences and his eventual death, that Elizabeth began to experiment. At first, the punishments were ordinary, by noble standards. A lazy kitchen maid might be slapped, or have her hair shorn. A clumsy chamber girl might be struck with a cane. These things were not just tolerated in noble households, they were expected. Discipline was a virtue. Order was survival. But Elizabeth did not stop there. She began testing thresholds. How much pain could the human body hold? How precise could punishment be? Could a girl still serve with one finger broken? Could a scream be tuned like an instrument? She was not alone in this. Her inner circle began to form. Anna Darvulia, some say a midwife, others say a witch, was the first. She arrived at the castle shortly after Elizabeth's second child was born. Sharp-eyed and soft-voiced, she whispered to Elizabeth about herbs that soothed and herbs that opened the mind. About symbols drawn under moonlight. About the power in suffering. Together, they pushed boundaries. They used needles. Red-hot tongs. They experimented with freezing water, then scalding oil. Elizabeth kept notes in a private journal, recording each reaction, each scream, each break. Then came Dorothea Sentis, also called Dorka, hardened and loyal to a fault. A former wet nurse with a taste for cruelty, and a booming laugh. She turned punishments into games. And Ilona Jo, the strict governess, who saw herself not as a torturer but as an educator. She believed discipline shaped character. Pain shaped obedience. The castle became a theater. Not of drama, but of repetition. A rhythm of capture, silence, and disposal. Peasant girls were taken from villages under pretense of service or training. Few returned. And still, Elizabeth's public face remained immaculate. She hosted dinners. She sent lavish gifts to bishops. She donated to convents. The Habsburg court still invited her to galas. She wrote poetry. But inside, the obsession grew teeth. The legend says she began to fear her own aging. That she looked in the mirror one night and saw a line beside her mouth, a shadow under her eye. And when a servant accidentally tugged her hair while brushing it, Elizabeth struck the girl across the face, so hard that blood splattered onto her skin. Later, as she wiped it away, she thought the spot looked smoother. Younger. It is, of course, just a story. But stories, like mold, tend to grow where there's moisture. After that, things escalated. She instructed her servants to bring only the youngest girls. Virgins. She wanted to refine them. She said their purity was a kind of magic. She said they were lucky to serve such a purpose. She began draining blood into bowls, wiping it onto her face like cream, bathing in it, though accounts vary. Some say it happened once. Others say it became routine. There was no longer shame, no longer secrecy. The rituals had become normal. But still, she documented everything. Every girl. Every name. A ledger of death dressed up as administration. Then, as her household grew careless, mistakes were made. A girl escaped. Another was found by travelers, delirious and half-dead. The whispers returned. This time, louder. And when noble daughters began to disappear, sent to the Countess for refinement, the whispers became accusations. The village priest, a brave man named Istvan Mygary, preached openly. He told his congregation that evil was rotting inside the castle. That no amount of gold or title could cleanse such blood. Elizabeth responded with threats. But it was too late. The crown was listening now. Debts were owed. Land needed reclaiming. And Elizabeth, once a shielded figure of reverence, had become a liability. You know what happened next. The raid. The walls. The silence. But the world didn't stop turning. After her death, Elizabeth's name became something else entirely. It became currency. The peasants spoke it as a curse. Parents warned their daughters not to stray too far, lest the ghost of the Countess find them. Children drew pictures of her on the backs of scraps: bloody teeth, long nails, dripping gowns. Writers and poets twisted her story. In Vienna, pamphlets sold for a coin each claimed she had killed 650 girls, eaten their hearts, danced in their skins. In Transylvania, she was whispered alongside vampire tales, her name invoked with the same nervous reverence as the devil's. But those who knew her, those few who remained, spoke of her differently. They remembered a woman who was cold, yes, but elegant. They remembered the sharpness of her wit, the precision of her words. They remembered her handwriting, her perfume, her peculiar love of astronomy. She was, after all, a woman of her time. Which means she was trapped. Trapped in a system where women were expected to be ornamental and obedient. Where their power was always borrowed, from fathers, husbands, kings. And when she wielded it as fiercely as any man, she was punished not for her crimes, but for her audacity. Was she mad? Perhaps. Or perhaps she was what her world made her: brilliant, brutal, deeply alone. The legends endure because they serve a function. They warn. They excite. They allow societies to project their darkest fears onto a single, elegant villain. They turn complexity into caricature. Elizabeth Báthory has become many things: a vampire, a witch, a feminist icon, a madwoman, a scapegoat. But at her core, beneath the stories, beneath the myths, she was simply a human being. Flawed, frightening, tragic. And as history moved on, her castle crumbled. The walls fell to ivy. The stones split in frost. The rooms grew quiet. Cactus became a ruin. But her name? It still echoes. You've heard it tonight. And now, at last, let us leave her in peace.